Hi, everyone. My name is Shawn. Welcome to the first episode of Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. This podcast and eventual YouTube channel is going to explore the history, legends, and mythologies from ancient sources with the goal to connect the dots from mythological gods to legendary heroes and eventually to historical figures, primarily the kings of the world's monarchies, many of which still exist today. For example, did you know that you can look at a historical figure like Alfred the Great of Wessex and take the Anglo-Saxon chronicle that traces his ancestry back to the Norse god Odin, or his Anglo-Saxon version, Woden? You were then also given a list tracing his ancestry all the way back to the supposed creation of the world to the biblical Adam. You'll see in the chronicle for the year 854 CE, it gives a direct line from Alfred's father Athelwulf to the biblical Adam using a non-biblical son of Noah, who was supposedly born on Noah's Ark, to make this line work. As it reads, AD 854, his body lies at Winchester. He reigned 18 years and a half. Then it gives his direct paternal ancestry for a while to the point where it says, Cynric of Creota, Creota of Chadic. Chadic is supposedly the first king of Wessex, an ancestor of the aforementioned Alfred. Then it keeps going. Round of Balde, Balde of Woden. But then the line keeps going. As the authors of the chronicle were Christian, they of course needed the first biblical man at the top. It then says, Bedwig of Skiff, that is the son of Noah, who was born in Noah's Ark. Lasnek, Methuselah, Eno, Jared, Malaleel, Canaan, Enos, Seth, Adam, the first man, just like that movie with Ryan Gosling. And our Father, that is Christ. Amen. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So while we're confident in Alfred's historical existence, it does raise the question, how much of his lineage is grounded in fact? And how much is a blend of mythology and legend? This is a really cool way, in my opinion, to think about how history and myth are blended together. Stories tied to real people, giving them magical properties, and or giving them divine ancestry to elevate their legend. Also, before we dive in, I did want to make a quick note, or maybe more of a disclaimer. Okay, fine, it's an excuse. I have no experience with video editing, but everything I've seen about starting a YouTube channel from other YouTubers who talk about creating YouTube content make it very clear that the best way to begin a YouTube channel is just to say, screw it, get started, and learn as you go. So here we are. If this video is not great or is downright horrible, feel free to blame those other YouTubers for giving me bad information or anybody else that deflects responsibility from me. For now, this channel is going to primarily focus on the Norse Eddas and Sagas. Though we are going to bridge out from there over time, the goal is to study stories of gods and kings across different cultures and times, and we will examine these ancient texts to uncover connections between various points of myth and history. These stories often blur the line between fact and legend, tying royal ancestries to mythological characters, as we just mentioned with King Alfred of Wessex. So, in today's episode, we're going to look at Harald Fairhair, the first king of a unified Norway, and his supposed divine ancestry. Using various sources, we're going to examine how the saga authors connected Harald's lineage directly to the Vanir gods Freyr and Niord on his father's side, and to the Norse god Odin on his mother's. So we know that the monarchy of Norway exists. The current king of Norway is King Harald V. We can also trace the Norwegian monarchy supposedly all the way to this Harald I, aka Harald Fairhair, who according to the source Heimskringla became a petty king upon his father's death at the age of 10 in 860 CE, but was able to conquer a majority of the country, elevating himself as the first king of Norway in 872 CE after the Battle of Hafrsfjord. And if you're from Norway, please yell at me on social media for butchering the pronunciation of the Norwegian place names. I will probably publish more content on the specifics of his rise to the station of king in other episodes. However, to sum it up in this episode, to give you some background, his father was a petty king named Halfdan the Black. His mother was named Ragnhild. Both parents had dreams and visions of the great fame their son would wield in the annals of history. This led to some resentment of Harald from his father Halfdan. Now, in the story of his father Halfdan's death, he hosted a feast for Yule one year. And when he and his men were about to sit down for supper, all of a sudden the food and drinks all disappeared from the table out of nowhere. Halfdan yelled out, "Why is the rum gone?" To which one of his men said, "But you don't understand, my liege. Everything just disappeared. There is evil magic afoot, and we must investigate in haste, but tread lightly. A sorcerer may be after us next." To which Halfdan then said, "But why is the rum gone?" His man, who you will find out was actually David Duchovny, then said, Are you serious? I just told you, my liege." The quote, investigation did not go too well. Halfdan had a Finnish or maybe a Sami person tortured to get information on what happened to his sustenance and to figure out why his dinner was ruined, information he did not get. The Finn in his cell asked the king's son Harald for mercy, which Harald then asked his father for on the Finn's behalf. However, Halfdan told his son no, and that he would continue torturing the Finn, probably something to do with the resentment of his son that I mentioned earlier, and him not wanting to give in to his pleas. At that point, Harald helped the Finnish man escape. When the escape was successful, the man then stated to Harald that he was indeed the cause of the food's disappearance, and then stated to Harald that his father was now dead, and then told the 10-year-old that one day he would conquer all of Norway. So, to sum it up, the magical Finn has some skill at foresight, and ruining Halfdan's dinner may have served as a sort of test of empathy that he failed, but his son Harald did not. There is also an interesting parallel here to the poem Grimnismal, found in the Poetic Edda, where the god Odin is captured by a king, only to be given a drink from the king's son who took pity on him. Odin then orchestrated the death of the king so his son could then inherit the kingdom, as he had the character to rule the kingdom better than his father. Also, as we see often in many of the sagas and myths, Odin will take disguises to get involved into the affairs of mortals, often his own descendants, as he often does with the Volsungs, and maybe Harald himself in this case. So I like to think that the Finn could be Odin as well, but this is probably a stretch, and I don't have enough confidence to make any claim with any conviction. However, if it is true, seeing as how Odin's divinity or his quote prowess in magic vary depending on the source or story, it is really hard to say. But the character of Odin, either a man or god, seems to be as powerful as the story needs him to be, which we will see in discussing the early portion of Yngling Saga. Now, prior to King Halfdan's death, he was a powerful king who took over many territories within the land of Norway in his own right. However, upon his death in 860 CE, many of his vassals rejected the need to bow to his 10-year-old son Harald, simply because he was the son of the previous king that they bent the knee to. Harald, however, with his maternal uncle, Duke Guthorm, was able to subdue his father's former vassals back into submission, either killing them or forcing them to bend the knee again. During his military campaigns to do so, he came across a woman named Gyda, who challenged his might and stated that if he was a real man, he would conquer all of Norway, and not just the land his father previously controlled. Harald then stated he would do so, and that he would not cut his hair until he did. Then again, in the Battle of Hafrsfjord in 872, he did become king of Norway and cut his hair, thus becoming Harald Fairhair. Funny, because in many, many of the Norse sagas, myths, and poems, one message or theme is that you cannot trust women because they will manipulate you. However, what is more so clear when you read between the lines is that men in the sagas are simply too easily manipulated. Often all it takes is for their masculinity to be threatened or questioned, and they bend to your will. So it is more so just the men being stupid or impulsive rather than the woman being not trustable. In a world where men wielded more physical and political power, women in the sagas often use wit and strategy to navigate their limited options in gaining influence and power, showcasing their resilience and resourcefulness rather than their inherent deceitfulness. However, there are many gray areas in the sagas for both men and women, and both are shown to often operate with sinister intentions. So it also depends on the individuals in these stories. Now, before I continue, I did want to acknowledge that with Harald, in this case, this wasn't necessarily him being manipulated, because as mentioned earlier, the Finn did say to Harald that it was his fate to rule Norway. So Harald may have viewed this conversation with Gyda as a part of his prophesized path. But anyway, going back to today, is the current king of Norway, Harald V, who traces his lineage through a series of paternal and maternal connections back to Harald Fairhair, also a descendant of the All-Father himself. You'll find out my subjective opinion on the matter right now, and my answer is no. So anyway, let's go ahead and discuss the key sources for Harald's ancestry. So the primary sources that we're going to be looking at today to explore Harald Fairhair's divine ancestry include Heimskringla, the Saga of the Volsungs, and the Saga of Ragnar Lodbrok. The first three chapters of Heimskringla, written by a man named Snorri Sturluson, that we will focus on are called Yngling Saga, the Saga of Halfdan the Black, and the Saga of Harald Fairhair. And we actually already discussed some of the content from the latter two chapters with Harald and his father Halfdan. Snorri Sturluson, the author, was a 13th century Icelandic politician who also had a famous work called the Prose Edda, which contains a large portion of what we know today about the Norse myths. Briefly, I will be quoting the Prose Edda today as well. However, the reason I bring it up here is that in both the prologue of the Prose Edda and Yngling Saga, Snorri discusses humanized versions of the Norse gods who migrated from what is now modern-day Turkey north to Scandinavia, where their legends and prestige and their apparent prowess in magic, despite being humanized versions of the gods, led them to be incorrectly worshipped as gods by the Scandinavians. Snorri Sturluson wrote these works in the 13th century, well after Norse paganism had ceased to be widely practiced as a religion. So Snorri himself was a Christian, and although he did not believe in the Norse gods, he saw the cultural significance of these myths and sought to preserve them in some capacity, and in making this work, he built them into his own Christian worldview through this pseudo-history. Additionally, in parts 2 and 3 of the Prose Edda, Snorri conveys the Norse myths that we know and love, showing the adventures of gods through dialogues between other characters, rather than making direct claims about their truths. In the section Gylfaginning, he presents a conversation between a King Gylfi and three aspects of Odin: high, just as high, and third, more seemingly humanized versions of Odin who were again well-versed in magic but not gods, just in case the three of them being aspects of the same person did not make that clear. Similarly, in the next session of the Prose Edda, Skadskaparmal, he describes the myths through a conversation between humanized versions of the gods Bragi and Aegir as well. Through these, quote, conversations, Snorri shares the stories that are probably thought of as truth to his ancestors, even if they were not to him or to his audience. Then in Heimskringla, his goal is sort of to prop up the Norwegian royal family by tying their ancestry to the Norse gods as well, something he does in considerable detail in Heimskringla, which is an insanely large book. So despite the fact that he did not believe in these gods, he felt compelled to tie the Norwegian royal line to them anyway. Again, the Norwegian royal court would have seen the cultural significance of this for the country, even though the country had been Christianized at that point. And using the first three chapters of Heimskringla, you have a direct paternal line to the Vanir god Freyr and his father Niord, going up 27 and 28 generations respectively, tying in Snorri's version of the creation of a unified Norway to the Norse gods, or these humanized versions of them. Now, the Saga of the Volsungs and the Saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, while not being a part of Heimskringla, are essential to understanding Harald's supposed maternal ancestry, as they connect him as a direct descendant of the god Odin through the House of Volsung. In fact, this line Odin would be Harald's direct ancestor by only 11 or potentially only 9 generations, which I'll explain later. Again, his mother being Ragnhild, who is both mentioned as a descendant of Ragnar Lothbrok's son, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, in both Heimskringla and in the Saga of Ragnar Lodbrok. So these sagas provide the framework for tracing Harald's connection to the Norse gods Freyr, Niord, and Odin. Now, I will say that even Harald, as a historical figure, is suspect. However, as he was written often about in many sources, like the aforementioned Heimskringla and the Icelandic sagas, who often discuss the settlement of Iceland being a result of the Norwegians trying to escape his rule, you can make a strong case using the historical method that he did exist. However, in Heimskringla, as we discussed, magic exists. So though some of Heimskringla may be accurate, at some point, the further they go back up, they probably started making some of the shit up, not unlike some of the mythical elements from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that I mentioned earlier. So let's review this line, getting started with the first chapter of Heimskringla, detailing Harald's paternal ancestors. Ynglinga saga, not unlike the prologue of the Prosetta, opens with a pseudo-historical account of Odin's migration from Turkey to Scandinavia. This humanized version of Odin is described as having extraordinary abilities, particularly his gift of foresight, which ultimately shaped his decision to travel northward with his people. So, as it states in Ynglinga saga, to the south of the fells, it is not far to the land of the Turks, where Odin had great possessions. At that time, the Roman emperors were going far and wide all over the world, and in battle beat down all the people. Because of the unrest, many lords fled from their lands. When Odin looked into the future and worked magic, he knew that his offspring would dwell in the northern parts of the earth. Ynglinga saga translated with the assistance of A.H. Smith. Here's the similar mentioned account from Snorri in the prologue of the Prosetta. Odin had the gift of prophecy, as his wife also did. And through this learning, he became aware that his name would become renowned in the northern part of the world and honored more than any other king. For this reason, he was eager to set off from Turkey, and he took with him on his journey a large following of people, young and old, men and women. Wherever they went on their travels, tales of their splendor were told, making them seem more like gods than men. The Prosleita translated by Jesse Bach. So as Odin and his followers journeyed north, you see that they were already being viewed in the same vein as deities. And by the time Odin arrived in what is now Sweden, he was already being worshipped as more than a powerful ruler or king. He himself settled down in Logren, which is near a lake near the western coast of modern-day Sweden, and also gave his loyal followers in the story, who would be his priest, places to settle as well. It says, Odin set his dwelling near Logren, where it is now called Gamla Sigtun, and where he built a large temple for blood offerings according to the customs of his people. He conquered all the land around it and called his place Sigtun. He gave the temple priests dwelling places. Niord lived in Noton, Frey near Uppsala, Hemdal by the Himmenfell, Thor in Thrudvang, Balder in Breidablik. To all them he gave good lands. Ynglinga saga, translated with the assistance of A.H. Smith. Another connection between this saga and the actual mythology is that the areas Odin assigned to his priest, clearly humanized versions of other gods in the mythology, are similar to the names of the lands in Asgard that the gods dwell in the myths. Thor receives Thrudvang, Balder resides in Breidablik, Hemdal in Himmenfell, though it's Himmenbjorg in the myths, reinforcing the blending of myth and pseudo-history that Snorri is trying to paint. So after settling down for a bit, this version of Odin dies, and not like, spoiler alert, Gylfaginning tells us he dies in the mythology at Ragnarok. However, he dies in his bed of what you can assume is just old age. As the text states, Odin died in his bed in Sweden, and when he was near death, he had himself marked with a spear point and dedicated himself to all men who died through weapons. He said that he should now fare to the Godheims and there welcome his friends. The Swedes now believed that he had gone to the old Asagoth and would live there forever. Ynglinga saga, translated with the assistance of A.H. Smith. After Odin dies, Niord then assumes the kingship over the Swedes, as you read here. Niord of Notin then took the rule over the Swedes and upheld the sacrifices. Then the Swedes called him their Drott, which means sovereign, just like the winner of the Kentucky Derby and as of yesterday, Belmont. And then he took Scott, which are taxes, from them. Niord then, at some point, also dies. And when he does, his son Freyr then takes over the kingdom, where he builds a temple in his land at Uppsala. So you see here that not only did Niord have a death, but he also had taxes. Insert laugh track. Heimskringla then states, Niord died in his bed. He also had himself marked for Odin before his death. So Frey took the rule after Niord. Frey built near Uppsala a great temple, and set there his chief seat, and endowed it with his income from land and chattels. That was the beginning of the Uppsala crown property, which has lasted ever since. Ynglinga saga, translated with the assistance of A.H. Smith. So I want to note that although the kingdom did pass from Odin to Niord, the text does not specifically identify Odin as being Niord's father, which royal succession throughout history and in the very next generation of this text is often a throne passing to the oldest son after the death of the king. However, here Niord succeeding to the throne seems to be from other arrangements. However, the throne does pass to his son Freyr after his death, where the pattern of father to son succession does become precedent. I could go a bit further into the war between the Aesir and the Vanir and talk about how the treaty afterwards could have played a part in this decision, Odin being an Aesir and Njord slash Freyr being Vanir, but that is going to be for another episode. So this is important to me because although we cannot show the ancestry to Odin through Harald's father's line in Ynglinga saga, Odin still plays a huge role in this story. I did mention that Snorri's comment on Odin, god or human, vary depending on the story he's trying to tell. And in this channel slash podcast, my plan is to try my best to lump these versions into one character to the best of my ability, despite the many contradictions that come with them. So for the sake of my narrative, Odin as a god and some of the other gods could simply have been trying to play a part in the affairs of mortals. In this case, taking on the role of a human and orchestrating their migration north. And upon his death, going back to his realm in Asgard, though in Ynglinga Saga, Asgard is depicted as a land here on Earth. So clearly, again, this is just my own fun interpretation. However, to counter my point about Odin and Njord slash Freyr being related, in Snorri's prologue of his Prosetta, he does list one of the human Odin's sons as being, quote, Yngvi. This character is the same as Freyr. And Yngvi is the namesake of the family moving forward, that being, quote, Yngling. So Snorri wrote both Heimskringla and the Prosetta. In each his first chapter, Yngling, a saga for Heimskringla, and the prologue for the Prosetta. However, despite many similarities in the overall narrative of both, Snorri does contradict himself every so often. In this case, on who Freyr slash Yngvi's father is. Odin according to the prologue and Njord according to Ynglinga saga. However, I am inclined to go with Njord as being the father, as Ynglinga saga has much more depth than the prologue, and in the next chapters of the Prosetta following the prologue, the ones that deal with the actual myths of the gods, Njord is also Freyr's father. So anyway, one could argue that Harald is a descendant of Odin on both sides of his family. However, I'm more inclined to go with the version that it is only his mother's. I will dive further into the prologue of the Prosetta next episode, where I will be discussing the mythical slash legendary slash, in many, many quotes, historical sons and descendants of Odin. The episode will be titled, quote, The Legacy of the All-Father. Anyway, now from this point, Ynglinga saga discusses each member of this line from Freyr onwards, with each member getting anywhere from 1 to a few paragraphs on the events of their lives and their deaths, in which a weirdly large proportion of them die because they got too drunk. Now, keep in mind at this point, Freyr is considered the king of the Swedes and is based in Uppsala. As Sweden and Norway were simply regions at this point and not unified states, Freyr would have been a king in Sweden and not the king of Sweden. And as kingdoms over time rise and fall, some kings gain and lose land over time. And you'll see that over the 27 generations before Harald, this happens quite often with this family, the House of Yngling. So this line tracks the familial line and it's not the kings of one location, if that makes sense. So I wanted to say this because over time, the land this family held went from Uppsala in Sweden to land in Norway by the time of Harald Fairhair's birth. Now, a quick background on the myths of Niord and his son Freyr. Though Odin is of the Aesir, Freyr and Niord were from the tribe of Vanir gods, who are widely considered to be gods of fertility. Chapter 23 of Gylfaginning from the Prosetta says this of Niord. He rules over the movement of the winds, and he can calm sea and fire. One invokes him in seafaring and fishing. The Prosetta, translated by Jesse Byack. For additional backgrounds, there was also a war between the Vanir and Aesir that is also elaborated on in Ynglinga saga. The peace treaty had Niord join the Aesir as a hostage, along with his son Freyr. After this, he marries a woman named Skadi, who is a daughter of the giant Thiazi. This did not seem to be a happy marriage because they hated each other's home, so they decided to live separately from one another. In Ynglinga saga, it states that Niord had an incestuous relationship with his own sister, and it states that this was common among the Vanir. And Niord's sister may have been the mother of both Freyr and the goddess Freya. However, in the Prose Edda, it states that Niord had two children after marrying Skadi. So it is not clear who Freyr and Freya's mother is. Based on the numerous sources, I am inclined to say that they are the children of Niord and his sister, and not Skadi, as Freyr and Freya were alive during and after this war, and Skadi's marriage to their father only took place after this treaty as well. Also, it is sort of implied that Freyr and his sister Freya also had an incestuous relationship as well. Not only was it mentioned as being common in the Vanir tribe in Ynglinga saga, but in the poem Lokasenna from the Poetic Edda, the god Loki calls out Freya for sleeping with her brother, but also calls Niord out for sleeping with his. Loki also says some other things that allow us to learn a lot about the Targaryens, I mean Vanir gods, as it says in Lokasenna stanzas 30 through 36. In stanza 30, Loki says, "Silence, Freya. You are not free from faults. I know you too well. You play the whore with every god and every elf who sits in this hall." Freya then says, and I apologize in advance for this, "You speak lies, and soon this kind of talk will cause you real trouble. The gods are angry at you, and all the goddesses too. You will go home friendless." Loki then says, "Silence, Freya. You are a witch, and have dealt out many curses. I hear the gods found you lying with your brother, and then you farted, Freya." Niord then steps in. "It is a small matter whether women sleep with their own men or others, but it's a surprise to hear such a sissy god talking here when he's born children." He's referring to Odin's horse Sleipnir. Loki then says, "Silence, Njord. You were sent from the west as a hostage for the gods. The daughters of Heimir used your mouth as a urinal, and you've tasted plenty of piss." Njord then says, and he does not deny it, "I had some good from that. When I was sent from the west as a hostage for the gods, I fathered a son, beloved by all, considered a hero among the gods." To which Loki then says, "Stop this now, Njord. Control yourself. I will not conceal this any longer. I know that you fathered that son Frey with your own sister, and I expect you've done even worse." As translated by Jackson Crawford. Anyway, I did want to provide that brief background of Niord, Freyr, and the Vanir before getting into their descendants, the line that results in Harald Fairhair. Let's just say I am not one to judge what consenting adults do for their enjoyment, but it seems the Vanir gods have certain inclinations in enjoying their bedrooms. So let me talk to you about the family line as told in Ynglinga saga. So we do start with Niord, his son Freyr, then it goes Fjolnir, Svegdir, Venlandi, Visber, Domaldi, Domar, Digvi, Dag, Agni, Alrek, Yngvi, Jorunds, and then it goes to a character named Un. Now I want to stop at this character Un, whose name is On the Old. On had some issues with his own mortality as a man, and not unlike Odin in the myths, or at least my interpretation of them, he didn't want to die and tried to get around that big part of anyone's life. So when he got old, he decided to make a sacrifice to Odin to extend his life. The good news for him was that this succeeded, and he was able to extend his life 9 times. The bad news is that every sacrifice he made was one of his own sons. Again, 9 of them. So one, you get why his name is On the Old, but I also wanted to make this note because it shows that even in this non-mythical version of the sagas, sacrifices to Odin, who again already died as a human in this very saga, work. Now, earlier in my quote on his death, it does say that many thought that Odin went to, quote, old Asgarth or Asgard on his death, but the saga also states that Asgarth is on Earth as well, specifically in Asia. So you could argue that the Asgarth he goes to after his death may be the actual Asgard from the myths where the gods dwell, and maybe Odin was a mortal in life, but became a god again in death, supporting my earlier note on him maybe going to Earth in the first place because he felt compelled to get into the affairs of mortals. Then upon his death, after he has some fun, he went back to the realm of the gods. Anyway, eventually On's plan stopped working as the Swedish population would not let him sacrifice his 10th son. So eventually he died of old age, thus passing the kingdom to that 10th son, Egil. So then the line continues. After Egil, it goes Otter, Adils, Eystein, Yngvar, Anund, Ingald, Olaf, Halfdan, Eystein, Halfdan, Gudrod, and then we get to Halfdan the Black. Again, the father of Harald Fairhair, as we discussed earlier. So that concludes Harald's paternal ancestry, linking him to the Vanir gods Freyr and Niord. Now we will move on to the Saga of the Volsungs and the Saga of Ragnar Lodbrok to show where Odin is a direct ancestor of Harald through his mother Ragnhild. Before that, however, we are going to briefly go into Odin's own ancestry according to the chapter Gylfaginning from Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. I'll leave the creation myth out for another time, but to sum it up, the Aesir were formed after the primordial cow of Thumla licked the blocks of ice that formed from the realm of Niflheim for her own nourishment. As she did this, the shape of a man appears, as it says in Gylfaginning. She licked the blocks of ice where they were salty. As she licked those stones of icy rime the first day, the hair of a man appeared in the blocks toward the evening. On the second day came a man's head, and on the third day the whole man. He was called Beri, and he was beautiful, big, and strong. He had a son called Bor, who took as his wife the woman called Besla. She was the daughter of Bullthorn the giant, and they had 3 sons. One was called Odin, the other Vili, and the third Ve. Prose Edda as translated by Jesse Back. So the first of the gods was Buri, and he had a son named Bor who had 3 sons, one of which was Odin. As he played a part in the creation of humanity from this point, and he was the leader of the gods, he was then considered the All-Father. Earlier, I noted that Odin played a huge part in setting up the line of Ynglings. Getting involved into the affairs of mortals is nothing new to Odin, so this also holds true with his kin, specifically the family of the Volsungs. So while going through this family line, I'll discuss Odin's role in the House of Volsung. So moving on to their saga. So we're going to go ahead and get started with Siggi. Siggi, the son of Odin, is banished from a land due to killing another man's slave out of jealousy. Odin guides him to a new land where he successfully builds a new kingdom. He has a son named Reyrir. Reyrir and his wife struggled to have children. Odin and his wife Frigg sent a Valkyrie to Reyrir to give his wife Hlad, a giantess, an apple, which helped her to conceive a child, that child being Volsung, the namesake of the family moving forward. Volsung was in his mother's womb for 6 years, and during that time his father Reyrir had died. When he was finally born, his mother passed as well due to the tough childbirth. Volsung, already looking like a 6-year-old child, kissed his mother as she died. Volsung eventually had 11 children. The primary one in the story was his son Sigmund and his twin sister Signy, the two of which also had an incestuous relationship which resulted in a child named Sinfjotli. And when Sinfjotli died, Odin was there to personally ferry him to Valhalla. But going back to Sigmund, one day his father Volsung was entertaining another king and his men in his hall, which featured a large tree in the middle called Barnstock. Odin, disguised as an old man, entered and stuck a sword into the tree, stating that only the man worthy enough to wield it would be able to pull it out of that tree. The man that was able to do so was Sigmund. Sigmund used the sword after his father's death and was a very capable warrior who won many battles, or at least until he didn't. One day in a battle, his sword broke and Sigmund was dealt a mortal blow. As he died, he acknowledged that Odin felt that his time on Earth was fated to end, and he died rather stoically at that point. Note that one of Odin's traits is that he influences the results of battles on Earth, orchestrating the deaths of the soldiers who would become Einarhar and feast with him in Valhalla. In this case, as he gave Sigmund the sword to begin, only to make it stop working at a certain point, he orchestrated both the rise and the downfall of his great-great-grandson, Sigmund. As it says in the Saga of the Volsungs, chapters 11 and 12, during a battle against a King Lyngvi, it says, quote, "And when the fighting had continued for a while, a man appeared in the fray who was dressed in a long hat and a blue cloak. He had only one eye and a spear in his hand. This man charged against Sigmund and hefted up the spear at him. And when Sigmund struck hard with his sword, he hit the spear shaft and his blade broke into 2 pieces," as translated by Jackson Crawford. Note that this description of Odin as a man in a brimmed hat is pretty consistent, to where even Sigmund knew that it was Odin. King Sigmund of the House of Volsung fell in battle, and as he died, he said, "Many live with little hope, but my luck has left me, so I will not let myself be healed. Odin no longer wishes for me to draw my sword, since he has now broken it. I have fought battles while it pleased him." As translated by Jackson Crawford. After this, Sigmund prophesies the upcoming birth of his son, who is the main character in the Volsung saga, and he is Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. So after King Sigmund's death in battle, his family actually lost the kingdom, so Sigurd was not a king in his own right, though he did find a place to live in the court of a Danish king. Odin, on 3 different occasions, directly intervenes with his life as well. Sigurd became famous for killing the dragon Fafnir and taking all of his gold. Funny enough, Tolkien was influenced by this saga in creating the dragon Smaug, who had a lair with gold as well in The Hobbit. So after killing Fafnir, Sigurd's story is marked by his love for Brynhild, a Valkyrie, who had fallen out of favor with Odin. Odin had cursed Brynhild after she defied him and had her locked in a tower. Though the chain of events is confusing and contradictory, Sigurd and Brynhild's paths connect, and they developed a passion for each other. However, despite their passion, Brynhild, who had the power to see the future, foresaw that she and Sigurd were not fated to marry. Instead, Sigurd wedded a princess Gudrun, leading to a complex and tragic Dark Age love triangle. Brynhild's sorrow and betrayal sparked a chain of events culminating in Sigurd's death, orchestrated by members of Gudrun's family, funny enough. Before Sigurd's untimely end, he and Brynhild did share one passionate night together, resulting in the birth of Aslog. Yes, this is the same Aslog you would have seen on the TV show Vikings. So Aslog's life was at risk due to the volatile environment. So she was smuggled out of her home by Brynhild's foster father, Heimir, for her safety. She was eventually raised and disguised as Kraka, a simple farmer's daughter. Aslog's lineage and her survival would later play a crucial role in the Saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, where she comes across and marries the main character, Ragnar Lodbrok, also the main character of the show Vikings. Though they have many famous sons, their connection to Harald Fairhair is through their son, Sigurd Snake in the Eye. Sigurd and his brothers go on many military and raiding campaigns with the intention to live up to the name of their father. And at one point on their way to Rome, also come across Odin in disguise. Odin convinces them to not go to Rome, but to return home, because Odin knew that they would need to be there to avenge their father, who was going to be killed by King Aella of Northumbria, which was also depicted on the show. Anyway, both the Saga of Ragnar Lodbrok and Heimskringla note that Harald's mother, Ragnhild, is a descendant of Sigurd Snake in the Eye. The saga simply states that Ragnhild is Sigurd's daughter, but Heimskringla states that she is his great-granddaughter. Heimskringla has another Aslog and another Sigurd in the mix, the third Sigurd being named Sigurd the Heart. Another source detailing Ragnar's sons, the tale of Ragnar's sons, goes into the exploits of Sigurd the Heart and his fight killing 12 men single-handedly, and his mother, who is named Aslog by Aslog. So the original Aslog, upon hearing about the death of her son, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, took in her granddaughter and named her after herself, hence the 2 Aslogs and now the 3 Sigurds. So depending on the sources, you either have Ragnhild as the daughter of Sigurd, the son of Aslog, the daughter of Sigurd, or you have Ragnhild, the daughter of Sigurd, the son of Aslog, the daughter of Sigurd, the son of Aslog, the daughter of Sigurd. I personally go with the latter and include the second Aslog named after her grandmother by her grandmother and her son, the fighter of berserkers, Sigurd the Heart. But in either case, after Ragnhild, that brings us back to Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway, showing his direct maternal line to Odin. So in reflecting on Odin's apparent effort to influence the mortal world, one cannot help but wonder if such meddling stems from a divine compulsion born out of boredom, much like a child playing with an ant farm because he had nothing better to do, either feeding the ants to help them flourish or using a magnifying glass to which to watch them burn. Odin's interventions in various sources seem to border between nurturing and manipulation. His involvement with the Yngling and the Volsung lines might have been an effort to control or accelerate the rise of kings and heroes, setting into the motion the fates that would lead to the birth of Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway, the same kingdom whose current king is Harald V, the modern-day royal family with his son Prince Haakon and granddaughter Princess Ingrid. Can the Norwegian royal family trace their ancestry all the way back to the All-Father himself? While I do not hold these claims to be historically accurate, it is fascinating to consider why figures like Snorri Sturluson felt compelled to assert these connections, which blends myth and reality and craft a lineage tied directly to the divine. So, thank you all for tuning in to the very first episode of Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings, where you primarily listen to me nerd out and overthink these old sources. If you have any thoughts or questions, please reach out to me on Instagram and maybe eventually TikTok if it's still accessible in the United States. And if you enjoyed this horribly edited episode, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I promise I'll become a better editor when this gets onto YouTube. As for my next episode, I will further go into Odin's apparent genetic imprint on the world by reviewing more mythical and historical sources of his sons and descendants. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.